all makes sense, and therefore isn't questioned, on the unspoken but critical assumption that the United States owns the world. If you don't accept that assumption, you're just not part of civilized discourse. And again, never assert it. That would be a bad mistake, kind of like a totalitarian state. Just instill it by constant presupposition. We all agree, when it's somebody else, that invaders have no rights. They have no rights to make any decisions, whether to withdraw or not. They have responsibilities. Prime responsibility is to pay reparations for what they did. The second one is to hold the guilty accountable by the standards of Nuremberg. The third responsibility is to attend to the will of the victims, which then withdraw. In the U.S.-UK case, it would be the same if we were willing to accept the most elementary of moral principles, namely Jackson's principle of universality, which is, of course, unthinkable. If we could, the responsibility would be to pay massive reparations. Going back to Saddam's takeover, it includes the sanctions and the wars, hold those accountable who sip from the poisoned chalice, and attend to the will of the victims, which we know. Well, none of that's on the agenda, none of it's even discussable. And again, for the same reason, that we own the world, the principle of universality is canceled. To bring it up would elicit either vilification or hysteria, or more often just incomprehensions, if you're talking Swahili or something like that. Also, not discussable are the reasons for the U.S.-UK invasion. Undiscussable. And for the unwillingness to withdraw without securing a dependable client state. It's a remarkable fact in free countries in the West that all of this is off the agenda, just as comparable questions were in the case of Vietnam and elsewhere. It's a topic for another talk. Let's go back to Nuremberg and aggression. I mentioned one provision of the definition of aggression at Nuremberg. There was another provision. It's Justice Jackson again. An aggressor is a state that commits such actions as provision of support to armed bands formed in the territory of another state, refusal, notwithstanding the request of the invaded state, to take in its own territory all the measures in its power to deprive those bands of all assistance or protection. Okay? Uncontroversially and unambiguously, that applies, for example, to the Reaganite War against Nicaragua. So by the standards of Nuremberg, those responsible should have faced the death sentence. But that level of adherence to the principle of universality is far too unthinkable even to be mentioned without horror. So hope you're not too horrified with mentioning it. Recall that Nicaragua did bring charges against the United States in the World Court. However, the court would not consider the charge of aggression. In fact, the court dismissed most of Nicaragua's case, which was presented by a distinguished Harvard law professor, Abram Chase. The court dismissed it on the valid grounds that when the United States accepted World Court jurisdiction in 1946, the U.S. excluded itself from prosecution under multilateral treaties. That includes the UN Charter and the Charter of the Organization of American States. So it's impossible to bring a charge of aggression against the United States. The court, same happened when Yugoslavia charged NATO powers a couple of years ago for the bombing. The U.S. immediately removed itself from the case, and the court accepted it correctly. The reason was that Yugoslavia had brought up the Genocide Convention, and when the United States finally ratified the Genocide Convention 40 years after it was established, there was a special provision saying it's inapplicable to the United States. So therefore, by law, the United States is immune to charges of aggression and genocide, and in fact, it extends far further. All of this would be taught in junior high school and societies that valued their freedom. You might ask how many of you are familiar with it and draw the conclusion. Well, even on the narrow grounds that were permitted, the court restricted itself, had to restrict itself to customary international law and a particular bilateral U.S.-Nicaragua treaty. And even on those narrow grounds, the court did condemn the United States for unlawful use of force, which means international terrorism. It demanded that the crimes be terminated and that the U.S. pay substantial reparations. That was backed by 2 Security Council resolutions, which the United States vetoed, with Britain and France politely abstaining. The press reacted by dismissing the court as a hostile forum. New York Times editors, which is true, they condemned the U.S., so they're hostile forums, so you should pay attention to them. A couple of years earlier, the same court had been lauded for supporting Washington in a case against Iran. Congress reacted by providing substantial new funding for the war, a bipartisan vote. The U.S. command reacted by issuing orders to its mercenary forces to attack what it called soft targets. That means undefended civilian targets, and to avoid the Nicaraguan army, which the mercenary forces could do thanks to CIA control of Nicaraguan airspace and sophisticated communication equipment in the hands of the mercenary forces. That was officially approved by the State Department. Well, the war against Nicaragua was only one small part of Reaganite terror in Central America, which itself was only a small part of Reaganite atrocities worldwide. Remember, that's pretty much the government now in office. And the reaction illustrates another useful device of sophisticated propaganda systems. When you're caught committing, here's some advice for those of you who are going into journalism, when you're caught committing huge crimes, don't deny them. That's a mistake. That raises the issues for discussion and analysis, and then you're in trouble. What you should do is portray the actions as noble and magnificent, so shifting the grounds. Here's an example from Newsweek a couple of weeks ago. This one was brought up by FAIR, media analysts. I hadn't noticed it. They had a prestigious columnist, international affairs columnist, Fareed Zakaria, and he lamented that the Bush administration, the current one, has been intervening in the domestic affairs of Latin America. That is, they're going back to the bad old days, he said, which came to an end when, I'm quoting, came to an end when Ronald Reagan orchestrated an extraordinary turnaround supporting human rights, democracy, and free trade. I mean, the audacity is stunning, but that's the right kind of response when you're caught as a serial killer. Call out how noble you are. You're reinstituting human rights, and you don't even know how to answer. The audacity is stunning. Actually, the Reagan administration broke new records in intervention in support of vicious mass murderers from Argentina all the way up to the Central American killers and torturers who practically destroyed 4 countries and reached literal genocide in the Guatemalan highlands, accompanied by fulsome praise from the saintly Reagan. There's a minor fib in his comment that has to do with free trade. In reality, Reagan doubled protectionist barriers and organized state intervention to save incompetent corporate management from Japanese competition that was wiping them out. Well, the technique is common. Harvard University has a Center for Media Studies, Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School of Government. It's directed by a respected media leader, Marvin Cowell. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, Cowell released a study of media coverage of the U.S.-Israeli invasion of Lebanon last summer. And you really have to read it to believe it. I don't have time to go through it, but I urge it. According to Cowell's account, the United States media were pawns in the hands of Hezbollah. They covered up Hezbollah crimes, and they condemned Israel for aggression, as it was fighting a two-front existential war for its survival. I mean, the number of lies and malicious distortions per paragraph is stunning, sometimes even comical. So, for example, it includes bitter condemnation of Middle East journalism, which does not accept their high standards of objectivity and is just a propaganda instrument. Biggest proof. The proof is a London-based Arabic journal that published 22 pictures of Lebanese civilian casualties, but only one picture of Israeli casualties. Now, the actual ratio of casualties was about 25 to 1. Okay? So by objective Western standards, you'd have equal numbers for the aggressors and the victims, not 22 to 1, understated, as in the corrupt Arabic press.